So, I'll be discussing the muscular system today. So, there are major muscles in the body. Now, the muscular system has nearly over 600 muscles, I think. So, starting with the first major muscle, which is the trapezius. Now, the trapezius' origin point is the occipital bone, and the insertion point is the clavicle. The next muscle is the pectoralis major. The origin is the clavicular head, and the insertion is the sternum, the deltoid, and the humerus. The reason why the insertion point is quite huge for this is because the pectoral muscle covers a large area of surface in the body, therefore having so many insertion points. The next is the biceps, otherwise known as the biceps brachii. Now the origin for this one is the scapula. The insertion point is the radial tuberosity. Next is the deltoids. Now the origin point for the deltoid is the clavicle, and the insertion is the tuberosity of the humerus. The next is the triceps. Now the origin of this is the scapula. The insertion is the posterior olecranon process of the ulna. The next is the latissimus dorsi. Now latissimus dorsi is one of the biggest muscles in the muscles if you look at it on a surface area to volume ratio, I suppose. Now its origin is the 9th to 12th ribs and inserts on the teres major plus the humerus. Again, has more than one insertion point because of the large surface area it's exposed to. The next is the erector spinae. Now the erector spinae is a large muscle on the back. The origin is the sacrum, the ribs and vertebrae, again because of the large surface area it is exposed to, and it inserts on the cervical and thoracic vertebrae. The highest insertion point here would be the cervical vertebrae. Next is the quadriceps. Now the quadriceps are made of three other muscles: the rectus femoris, the vastus medialis, and the vastus lateralis. The origin of all these are the hip joints and inserts on the patella. The next is the hamstring. Hamstring is made out of three muscles: the biceps femoris, the semitendinosus, and the membranosus. This muscle originates on the pelvis and inserts onto the tibia. The next is the anterior tibularis. Now this runs up the tibia. Now the origin is the tibia, and the insertion is the first metatarsal of the foot. And next is the soleus. Now soleus is on the opposite to anterior tibialis. Its origin is the fibula, and insertion is the tendocalcaneus. It connects to the gastrocnemius to form this tendon. The next is the gastrocnemius itself, and the origin is the femur, and the insertion is the calcaneal tendon. Now the next slide is the main function of the muscles. There are many functions of the muscles, such as causing movement, so bending our arm, concentric contractions and all that, maintaining posture, so keeping us upright, generating warmth, so that's keeping our body at optimum temperature of 37.5 degrees Celsius to keep all enzymes, cells running optimally, and for digestion, so contraction of the digestive tract or smooth muscle will push food towards our intestines through our digestive tract and so on. And expanding on the types of muscles, so the first muscle I talked about is skeletal muscle. Now this shape is elongated, as you can see on the illustration of the cell. Also there are visible striations, and this is the voluntary muscle. An example of this would be the bicep. We can choose whether to tense or relax our bicep. Now the next muscle is the cardiac muscle, and the cardiac muscle is branch in shape, but still keeping that elongated cell shape. And yes, there's still very visible striations, but this is involuntary. For example, our heart, we don't choose when our heart beats or doesn't beat. Next is the smooth muscle. Now the smooth muscle is spindle shaped, so this kind of helps to keep the blood flowing through our arteries, our veins, quite smoothly. There's no visible striations, therefore called smooth muscle, and this is involuntary. Again, we don't tell our veins or arteries keep the blood flowing. The next is the muscle fibers, the contrasts. in the different muscle fiber types. So we have type 1, type 2A and type 2B. Type 1 is exclusive to long distance runners. These are slow twitch fibers. The second is type 2A. Now these are typically for 400 meter, 800 meter sprinters. These are fast twitch, oxidative. These kind of tap into aerobic and anaerobic supplies. Now the next is type 2B. This is more for short sprints, fast twitch glycolytic absorption. So this mainly uses your anaerobic systems. And as you can see, type 1 doesn't get as fatigued as much. Type 2A, its fatigue rate is getting higher. And type 2B, the fatigue rate is very high. Now here's a video to explain muscle fibers in depth.
Muscles are the driving force of all movements in the body, varying from lifting, running, walking, and even organ function. The muscular system consists of 3 major muscle types: cardiac muscles, which are responsible for function of your heart, smooth muscles, which are responsible for the function of all your other organs, and skeletal muscles, which are responsible for, as the name suggests, the movement of your bones. Both smooth and cardiac muscles function involuntarily, meaning they operate by themselves. Skeletal muscles, on the other hand, function voluntarily and are under our conscious control. There are 3 different skeletal muscle fiber types, known as type 1, type 2A, and type 2X fibers. The difference of size, color, contractual speed, contractual force, and energy source classifies each fiber. Type 1 fibers, also known as slow twitch fibers, are the smallest fiber types with a darkish red color. It has a fairly slow twitch speed and produces a relatively small amount of force when contracted. It has high amounts of mitochondria, which are organelles within each cell that uses oxygen to produce energy. Although the force generated is fairly small, type 1 fibers are highly fatigue resistant, allowing it to be active for long periods of time. They are the primary fibers used during low-intensity activities with steady oxygen consumption, such as walking, jogging, or aerobics. Type 2A fibers, aka moderate fast twitch fibers, are also red but intermediate in size. These larger fibers typically use a combination of oxygen and glucose as a source of energy. This combination allows for quicker contracting speed and higher force output compared to type 1 fibers. However, fatigue resistance isn't as high. These fibers are typically activated during anaerobic activities that are moderate in duration, such as a mile run, swimming, and short-distance cycling. Type 2X fibers, aka fast twitch fibers, are white in color due to the low oxygen capacity and by far the largest fiber type. It makes up for the lack of oxidative capacity by having extremely high levels of glucose in its stored form of glycogen, producing the fastest twitch speeds and the most force. The downside, though, is that the fiber fatigues quickly, burning out after 15 to 30 seconds. High-impact, heavy resistance activities such as lifting weights and sprinting will activate type 2X fibers the most. For any activity, your muscles follow a certain recruiting order. The slow twitch, low force, fatigue-resistant type 1 fibers are always activated first. When type 1 fibers are maxed out, type 2A fibers are activated, and then after those are maxed out, type 2X fibers are activated. This order, known as the Henneman's size principle, helps minimize muscle fatigue and allows precise motor control by using no more than the force necessary to complete a movement. Everyone has a genetically determined amount of each muscle fiber type. Some people are born with a predominant amount of a certain muscle fiber, making them effective with activities that favor those fibers. There have been some findings that suggest that type 2X fibers can change into type 2A fibers with proper training. However, this might simply be due to type 2X fibers showing higher oxygen capacity through physical adaptation. They are ultimately still type 2X fibers. Based on your exercises, which muscle fibers do you train the most? Leave your answers in the comment section below. If you enjoyed watching, please click the like button. And for more future Picture Fit videos, don't forget to subscribe.
Yep, so hopefully that explains muscle fibers better than I could have. Next. So, I'm going to talk about muscle fibers and how they contrast sports. So, type 1 fibers, as you know, are also known as slow twitch fibers. These are red in colour due to the presence of large volumes of myoglobin in them and high numbers of mitochondria, therefore more energy. Due to this fact, they're very resistant to fatigue and are capable of producing repeated low-level contractions by producing large amounts of ATP through an aerobic metabolic cycle. But, on the contrary, we have type 2A fibers, who also produce large amounts of ATP, but they do so through utilizing both aerobic and anaerobic metabolism, and so produce fast, strong muscle contractions. Although they are more prone to fatigue than type 1 fibers, resistance training can turn type 2B fibers to type 2A due to an increase in the ability to utilize oxidative cycle. Again, type 2A fibers are also sometimes known as fast oxidative fibers, compared to type 1 fibers being known as slow twitch fibers. Then we have type 2B fibers. Now, these are often known as fast glycolytic fibers, and they are white in colour due to a low level of myoglobin and also contain few mitochondria, therefore there's not much energy there. They produce ATP at a slow rate by anaerobic metabolism and break it down very quickly. This results in short, fast bursts of power and rapid fatigue. Now, as mentioned before, this type of fiber can be turned to type 2A fiber by resistance training, and this is a positive change due to the increased fatigue resistance of type 2A fibers. And these fibers are found in large quantities in the muscles of the arms. So, if we're talking about which fibers can be used for which sports, so type 1 will generally be marathon runners, type 2A will be powerlifting, and type 2B will be sprinting. And these all contrast with each other due to the differences I've just stated now, and again, very different to one another, except type 2 and type 2B. So yeah, so we have marathon running, powerlifting, and sprinting. Me personally, I use probably type 2A or type 2B, powerlifting and sprinting, as I train those the most, and that's what my genetic build is. Next, I'll be talking about gym-based exercises and the agonist, the antagonist, the synergist, and the fixator muscles. So the first is the chest press. Now the agonist here is the pectoral. The antagonist is the latissimus dorsi, and the fixator is the rhomboids and abs, keeping the whole body stable, and the synergist is the anterior deltoid. Now, moving on to the leg press. The agonist here is going to be the quadriceps, and the antagonist is going to be the hamstrings. The fixator is the abdominals, keeping the knees parallel with the press, therefore keeping the person and his back safe. And the synergist here is the gastrocnemius, as you can see. Now, the overhead press or military press. The agonist here is the deltoids. The antagonist is the latissimus dorsi, and the fixator is the abdominals, keeping the person stable. And the synergist here is the triceps, which is a secondary muscle being used to help lift that weight up. My last gym-based exercise or sporting example would be the bicep curl. And the agonist here is the bicep, antagonist the tricep, the fixator is the deltoid, and the synergist is the brachialis. Now, there are many types of contractions, such as the concentric phase. So, for example, in a bicep curl or a dart throw, the concentric contraction in the bicep brachii during the upward phase of the exercise makes the bicep peak a little, and the bicep starts to tension and shorten. Pull the forearm upwards to cause flexion in the elbow. Then we have the eccentric phase. So this eccentric contraction is basically the muscles, is basically the downward phase of an exercise. For example, pull-ups. If we're focusing on the negative contraction, as we lower ourselves down, the muscle is lengthening, and if we're doing it slowly, our muscles start to tear, therefore making more muscle tissue. Basically slowing and going back to the forearm example that's been shown here, slows the lowering of the forearm, controls extension of the elbow. So then we have the isometric contraction. Now the isometric contraction occurs in the biceps brachii when the muscle's holding the weight still, so maybe cheat curl with a 5-second pause. And the biceps brachii develops tension and stays the same length. It stops flexion and extension of the elbow. Now, sliding filament theory. Sliding filament theory is something that explains the muscle contractions that happen on a day-to-day basis, looking at the muscles more in depth and through microscopical means. I have a video here that will hopefully explain it. Here we go.
You use muscles every day to do activities. This woman is using muscles to breathe, circulate blood, and move her hand to take notes. Your cardiac and smooth muscle tissues are involuntary. You do not consciously control their actions. Skeletal muscle works under voluntary control. Skeletal muscles are composed of bundles of muscle fibers. Muscle fibers are long cylindrical cells containing several nuclei. Muscles will contract or relax when they receive signals from the nervous system. A neuromuscular junction is the site of the signal exchange. This is where the synaptic bulb of an axon terminal and muscle fiber connect. Muscle fibers are composed of many myofibrils. A myofibril contains contractile units called sarcomeres. Sarcomeres run adjacent to one another down the length of the myofibril. Each sarcomere consists of alternating thick and thin protein filaments, giving skeletal muscle its striated appearance. The muscle contracts when these filaments slide past each other. The thick filaments are myosin, which are anchored at the center of the sarcomere, called the M line. The thin filaments are composed of the protein actin, which are anchored to the Z lines on the outer edges of the sarcomere. Because the actin filaments are anchored to the Z lines, the sarcomere shortens from both sides when actin filaments slide along the myosin filaments. Although the action between the filaments is described as sliding, the myosin filament actually pulls the actin along its length. The cross bridges of the myosin filaments attach to the actin filaments and exert force on them to move. This action is known as the sliding filament mechanism of muscle contraction. In this model, the sarcomeres shorten without the thick or thin filaments changing in length. A contraction begins when a bound ATP is hydrolyzed to ADP and inorganic phosphate. This causes the myosin head to extend and can attach to a binding site on actin, forming a cross bridge. An action called the power stroke is triggered, allowing myosin to pull the actin filament toward the M line, thereby shortening the sarcomere. ADP and inorganic phosphate are released during the power stroke. The myosin remains attached to actin until a new molecule of ATP binds, freeing the myosin to either go through another cycle of binding and more contraction or remain unattached to allow the muscle to relax. Muscle contractions are controlled by the actions of calcium. The thin actin filaments are associated with regulatory proteins called troponin and tropomyosin. When a muscle is relaxed, tropomyosin blocks the cross-bridge binding sites on actin. When calcium ion levels are high enough and ATP is present, calcium ions bind to the troponin, which displaces tropomyosin, exposing the myosin binding sites on actin. This allows myosin to attach to a binding site on actin, forming a cross bridge. Calcium ions are stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum and are released in response to signals from the nervous system to contract. Neurotransmitter molecules are released from a neuron and bind to receptors, which depolarizes the membrane of the muscle fiber. The electrical impulse travels down the T-tubules and opens calcium stores. Calcium ions flow to the myofibrils, where they trigger a muscle contraction. As the actin and myosin slide along each other, the entire sarcomere shortens as the Z lines draw closer to the M line. As the sarcomeres in myofibrils contract, the entire muscle fiber will shorten. When muscle fibers contract in unison, a muscle can produce enough force to move the body, allowing you to take notes.
And that's sliding filament theory explained. Thank you for listening.